Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar of this year in our series. I'm Ellen Lautenberg, Advisory Board Chair for the Mount Sinai Institute for Exposomic Research. And I've had the privilege of being involved in Mount Sinai's environmental health work for more than a decade. When I first started, the focus was really primarily on children's health. Over time, the science and the work has expanded to cross the entire lifespan. Today's conversation reflects that evolution, how exposures early in life, even before birth, can shape health decades later, including brain health and Alzheimer's disease. While I was telling people about this webinar, I mentioned that although the topic really may sound like it's really more for older people, the reality is that's not the case. For example, parents should be aware of the things that their children are exposed to so that they may impact them later in life. But we all have friends and family members that can benefit from this knowledge at whatever stage of life they are at. I'm not suggesting that we can totally control our environment, but one of the key messages you'll hear today is that while we can't change our genetics or undo past exposures, we can understand risk and use that information to make healthier choices now, recognizing that even simple changes can still be hard to do, like eating better, exercising, or prioritizing sleep. It's truly a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Wright. Dr. Wright is co-director of the Institute for Exposomic Research and the Ethel H. Wise Chair of the Department of Environmental Medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. He is a pediatrician, medical toxicologist, and environmental epidemiologist whose work has helped establish the field of exposomics, which is the study of environmental exposures across a lifetime. With that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Dr. Wright.
So I always like to put in a shameless plug for my blog. So if you were to Google, it's also on Substack. It's not just on the website. If you Google Exposome blog, I believe it's still the only Exposome blog on Substack, so you should be able to find it. And actually, I have a post from this morning, which actually parallels much of what we're going to talk about today, which is about understanding the origins of Alzheimer's disease, and just as importantly, what you can do about it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some intersections, particularly an intersection that doesn't get talked about enough, which is the role of timing and biology. So how beneficial or toxic environmental exposure depends in part on the dose, and we've all heard the phrase, the dose makes the poison. It's determined by other factors, males versus females, the presence of a disease. You might be more sensitive if you have a chronic disease. No one is exposed to a single chemical, so the presence of other chemicals that might be toxic, or even other chemicals that might be beneficial, nutrients. There is also some risk also conferred by your genetics that may interact with that exposure. But the age at which you're exposed actually plays perhaps the biggest role of how toxic an environmental exposure may be, or even how beneficial an environmental exposure will be. And I'm going to give you an example, actually, that will show some of the benefits of a very specific environmental exposure. This is a very old experiment, and sometimes science can seem cruel, but some of the first evidence that illustrated the role of timing of environmental exposure were actually done in kittens in the late 1950s. So Wiseau and Hubble did an experiment where they patched one eye of the two eyes of a newborn kitten for a month. And then they looked at the development of their retina, which really is all about neuronal connections that respond to light. And those neuronal connections in the patched eye never develop. Remember, this is a newborn kitten. That eye will become permanently blind after a month, whereas the unpatched eye, which got normal light sensation, is normal. If you do the exact same experiment in an adult cat, patching it for 1 month, and you compare the neuronal networks between the patched and the unpatched eye, there'll be minimum difference, and the patched eye will still be able to see. The difference in the experiment is the timing. So the kitten still has to develop its neuronal network. It has to experience life, in other words, including light and being able to understand vision and build that network that can actually respond to vision. In an adult, when you patch the eye, that network has already been produced, so it is less impacted. When it doesn't yet exist, it is more permanently impacted and more sensitive to even a small deviation. And this really illustrates the importance of child environment. It actually will last a lifetime. So the person who really brought this home in humans was a man named David Barker from the University of Southampton, who did some studies in the 1980s that showed that if you had very low birth weight, based on your birth certificate, you were at higher risk for developing heart disease 50, 60 years later. In fact, these concepts were originally called the Barker hypothesis. Nowadays, it's called the developmental origins of health and disease. But really what it's about is that your early environment is the foundation upon which your health is built. And research in DOHaD, or developmental origins of health and disease, has been relatively scant, and we'll talk about why that is. So, but if you can think about it like this. So think about your life as a trajectory. So you have all these events that happen in childhood, events that happen when you're a young adult, a middle-aged adult. And let's say we're studying Alzheimer's disease. We tend to conduct the research way over here on the right. All these things that happened in your early life or childhood or even your middle adult life, those are black boxes to the researcher. We never measured them because we didn't enroll you until towards the end of life. We know that genes and environment change over time, or environmental changes over time cause interactions that influence our health trajectory. And DOHaD is really about that trajectory, not the destination. So we tend to do research looking at the endpoint, i.e. the destination. But in reality, how you get there probably plays a big role. So I'm a pediatrician, as Ellen noted. I've spent my entire career studying brain development, which is really the beginning of this story. Neurodegeneration, which is the process by which your brain starts to have inflammation and breakdown and can lead to Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, it's typically studied as a separate process. This is the end. So I've been studying the beginning. Neurodegeneration is the end. But what about the middle? There has to be a transition point. We don't need research to know that. It has to exist. But almost no one has published on what is that transition point from which our brains stop developing and start degenerating. It has to exist somewhere. At a bare minimum, neurodegeneration is going to occur on top of that synaptic or neuronal network architecture that was created in your childhood. So whatever happens to your brain, in other words, as an adult, where things start to break down, there's some foundation that was built when you were young. And that is the process by which it's happening. It could be a very strong foundation. Think about different types of housing in a hurricane. Some of them are going to be able to withstand it, and some of them are not going to be able to withstand it. That's really what's happening. So if you build a strong foundation early in life, you're going to be able to weather the storm better later in life. And there's some evidence that this may be true. So you can actually predict, in some cases, who's going to get Alzheimer's disease at a relatively young age. And in fact, we're finding this more and more, that some of the prodromal symptoms of Alzheimer's disease can be detected at 40 and 50 years of age. This is a sometimes forgotten study from the 1990s called the Nun study, which took place in Wisconsin. And they did something really, really interesting. So when nuns enter a convent, they have to write an essay. And those essays were saved. Those essays were probably written in the 1920s. And then 60 to 70 years later, after many of them had passed away, some portion of them had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, they were able to take those essays that were written in the 1920s, and they could actually predict which nuns would develop Alzheimer's disease. And remember, this is before artificial intelligence and large language models, which I'm sure you're hearing about on the news all the time. This was actually done in a much more primitive fashion in the 1990s. And they found that if you had poor idea density, which is a measure of how many ideas per sentence you have, or negative emotions in your writing, you are more likely to have Alzheimer's disease. But that raises a different question. So did these young nuns that were destined to have Alzheimer's disease, did they have Alzheimer's disease pathology at age 19? Or maybe they had poor neural development, or maybe they had both. And when did all these things take place? When was the start, in other words? So that's why I think understanding the shape of the trajectory may reflect different health states. As I said, we tend to focus on the destination, what happens to us at age 70 or 80, and we don't think about how we got there. But there may be different ways that we got there, or there's certainly different ways that we got there, and the way that we got there may be important. Which brings up a dilemma. So I mentioned that there's very little research in this area of developmental origins of health and disease, particularly for Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. And that's because if you try to do this prospectively, let's say you enroll a group of children today and you measure their blood leads, if you think lead is a risk factor for later life Alzheimer's disease, and you follow them for the next 60 to 70 years to see if they end up having Alzheimer's disease, we will all die before that study is complete. So it's not a realistic approach. We're trying to go backwards in time. So we're taking people who have Alzheimer's disease and maybe some controls and trying to determine whether or not they were exposed to childhood risk factors. And some of you have heard Dr. Manish Arora, who's a dentist and a chemist. He's developed a biomarker that can reconstruct exposures during early childhood. But even so, if your tooth fell, and he uses teeth to do this, if your tooth fell out at age 7, well, what happened between age 7 and age 70? And that's a big black box still. So it helps to get that early life event or events, but there's a lot of life that happens in between, and that may be also important. So I'm involved in a project where we're actually trying to map air pollution back to the 1950s. Remember, EPA was actually established in the early 1970s. So there weren't air pollution monitors back in the 1950s. So it's really hard to reconstruct this, but we're working on different ways to do that. And if you were part of a research project like the Framingham Heart Study, there might be a biobank that can be used to reconstruct your environmental exposures from the 1940s or 1950s to see whether or not they predict your later onset of Alzheimer's disease. I think more and more we're developing methods to actually go back in time and reconstruct some of these environmental exposures. So, but it's not just the environment. I've talked about the trajectory. The trajectory that I'm showing on this slide is not an exposome trajectory. It's a health trajectory. It's the way your brain has developed over time and eventually degenerated with age. So our health evolves over time. We can be healthy one day and unhealthy the next. A lot of health status comes and goes. Depression, for example, is often thought of as a state rather than a trait because you can change and you can go back to being depressed. Same with obesity and asthma. It can appear, disappear, and reappear. Some illnesses lead to other illnesses. So obesity might cause diabetes, which might cause heart disease, and heart disease is a risk factor for dementia. So the way we get there maybe through some exposomic factor that caused the obesity, but didn't directly cause the dementia, but actually led to this sort of chain of events that were all health status events. So when we see a patient at age 75 or 80, we don't really know how they got there. So we don't know what the pattern was. And the shape of that trajectory might be important. I use the analogy that perhaps it's the journey, not just the destination. So how might this operate? So it may be that you have a unusual neural network because you're environmentally exposed to a neurotoxicant such as lead. And that might make you vulnerable to neurodegeneration. So maybe your trajectory looks something like that, which is relatively flat. So you have a baseline developmental, poor development because of environmental exposures. Perhaps it's lead, perhaps air pollution, or maybe it's child obesity. Or maybe you had great childhood environment and you developed really, really well, but then you subsequently were exposed to different things like maybe occupational lead poisoning or obesity as an adult or air pollution, and you have a steeper decline. There's another way to end up at the same destination. Or you might have multiple risk factors. Maybe you have an occupation with lots of exposures to concussions. So you may have sort of a bumpy little ride between during your adulthood that actually ultimately led to Alzheimer's disease. Predicting the shape may be important, and we don't really have a way to do that unless we can reconstruct your past health status. So we don't want to just reconstruct your past environment. We want to reconstruct your past health. Because, as I said, it might be the shape of the trajectory that matters. But also keep in mind your trajectory going forward can be changed, and we'll talk about that. So Alzheimer's disease has certain types of pathology. These can be seen by PET scans, which are positron emission scans. These are invasive. They require a radioactive nuclide be injected into your bloodstream in order to see the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. Or we can do a spinal tap and get your cerebrospinal fluid and measure. But it's, again, very, very invasive. Well, recently, there are now blood tests that can actually do this. So they're called phosphorylated tau proteins and amyloid beta proteins, and they can be measured now in your blood, and they seem to correlate very strongly with the PET scans and the CSF measures of Alzheimer's disease pathology. Probably the one that's most studied is phosphorylated tau 181, although there's several of them. They're expressed at young ages. Interestingly, they go up after you've had a concussion, so we will see them in children. But remember when I told you about the NUN study? So we can study writing samples to get a sense of your brain health at any given age. And most of us have writing samples when we were young. Most of us probably wrote a college entrance essay or a graduate school essay, or we may have some other letters that we've written. I mean, in the old days, I'm assuming most of us have written letters when we were younger. There may be ways to analyze writing samples. That might be, if we have some archived blood, we could start to look at whether or not what your trajectory is of your health and whether or not you had any evidence of Alzheimer's disease pathology earlier in life. So future directions for predicting the past. So I think it's an exciting time to be doing this kind of DOHaD research because I think there are avenues now that didn't exist even 10 years ago. Virtually every healthcare system now has an electronic health record, which means it can be mined by researchers, and we can use artificial intelligence to not just look at diagnostic codes, but actually read the text. These are what are called large language models, so that we can get a sense of how your health has changed over time, because there's always going to be calendar dates with each of your healthcare visits. We can also look at tremor if we have handwriting. Tremor might be a sign of early Parkinson's disease. And as I said, there may be essays that you wrote for school or job applications or letters to family and friends that could be analyzed that could give us a sense of the trajectory of your brain development and potential neurodegeneration over time. And it might not just be for brain health. There may be family photos that could be used. Your height doesn't change very much, so the photo could be used to estimate your weight and your BMI trajectory. And obviously some of that information is going to be in the electronic health record, including things like blood pressure and hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of early onset diabetes. And if we have that information to measure your health trajectory and we combine that with environmental data, maybe we can start to understand why your trajectory may be changing at different times. I think the key to this may actually be geography, because geography is a means to understand our past. We can make maps of our chemical environment, our social environment, and our physical environment, put them all on a common platform and connect them to our address and our address history. One of the things that I think has not been fully leveraged by researchers or healthcare professionals is this information that we've known now for about a decade, that zip code consistently predicts our lifespan better than DNA. And zip code is a really crude measure of where we live. It encompasses many, many square miles. In rural areas, it can be hundreds of square miles at times. And yet, we don't use that information as a predictor of health, even though it's actually more informative than DNA. But if we were to make maps of different types of environment, whether it's air pollution or climate, such as temperature or storms or allergens or our built environment and walkability around our neighborhoods, if we were to make those and you were to give that information to a physician and he or she could put that inside a map, and if we knew your address history, we could start to construct what your risk factors were, and we could start to relate that to your current health. And if we can relate that to your current health, perhaps we could give you more precise advice on what you need to do to stay healthy. So as towards the end of the developmental origins of health and disease part of this talk. So, but in summary, dementia risk starts early in life. It continues in adulthood. The risks are a mix of brain development and neurodegeneration that you experience in adult life, brain development that you experience in childhood. And I want to emphasize it's never too early to prevent Alzheimer's disease, but it's also never too late because remember, it's a trajectory. And that's why I kept emphasizing the trajectory. That trajectory going forward, its direction can be changed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about precision medicine versus health span. So you've been hearing a lot about precision medicine over the last 15 years. It's been a priority at the National Institutes of Health. I think health span has gotten more popular in the last few years, and I think a lot of that might be a reaction to precision medicine. Precision medicine is about treating disease. Once you have a disease, it can help you, but it doesn't offer a lot if you don't have a disease. So for healthy people, precision medicine, there's not much there. And then when you're talking about neurodegeneration, treating dead neurons is going to be very, very challenging. It has been challenging. It is challenging. It's not clear what would happen if we could reverse, bring them back to life, because presumably your memories are gone. So I'm not convinced that we're going to be able to treat Alzheimer's disease, but we may be able to slow it down or stop it. And I think that's very, very important. And remember, health span plays into that because health span is about not getting sick. It's really about how do I stay or become healthier? And everyone can use it today. And in fact, I would argue that we can use information from our past exposome and our past health trajectories to understand how we can best alter the trajectories that we have today. So how might we implement DOHaD, or Developmental Origins of Health and Disease? Well, keep in mind the past is a memory, the future is imagined, we only have now. So we can't change the past. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we can change our trajectories towards a more healthy outcome if we change what we're doing today. So, and I think this is important. I think in healthcare and in public health, the biggest bang for the buck is absolutely in trying to get young people to change their behavior. What we tend to forget about is that when you're young, dementia is 30, 40 years away. It's really hard to get them to take seriously what's being asked of them. At the same time, the fact that I had lead poisoning, or perhaps I was overweight when I was younger, I can't unchange that. That happened to me. It had an impact on my body or my brain, but I can't undo it. So the past cannot be changed. So how can we use DOHaD in practice? Well, as I said, we can learn from it, and we can learn from it to try to improve our future. So this is where healthspan comes in. I'm a big fan of healthspan. I think it is a great way to think about healthcare and also how to live your life. So a large portion of people are motivated to stay healthy, especially people with a chronic disease. So I don't know, some of you may know that I had heart surgery a little over a year ago. So I count myself as somebody with a chronic disease. And so I'm motivated to live a healthier life. And I think we need to start trying to get our health messages to people who are motivated to stay healthy, because they're the ones who are going to take up those messages. So perhaps if we could reconstruct a history of your personal risk factors, whether it was lead or air pollution, obesity, we could tailor information for you to actually try to improve your health. And that may include your trajectory, maybe trying to reconstruct your body mass index or your cognitive abilities over time to see what the direction is that it's taking. And then if we know your genetic risks and your past environmental risks, that can also add to that. And we can start to plot those trajectories and implement healthier exposomes now, which is really the only time you can do anything. But we can do it for people who are receptive to the message. So focus on people with a chronic disease and those motivated to be healthier. I think we've been forcing implementation onto younger populations who won't take it up. And I think we need to expand our message to people who have chronic illnesses. And I would argue that this is precision health span rather than precision medicine. So what else can we do? Well, there's a very common genetic risk factor called ApoE4 for Alzheimer's disease. What I think is sometimes lost, particularly in press stories about it, is that it's not really a cause of Alzheimer's disease. First of all, the vast majority of people with Alzheimer's disease do not carry this variant. And even though as many as 20% of the population may have it, about half of them never get Alzheimer's disease, even if they have two copies of this genetic variant. So it definitely increases the risk, but it is not fate, which means we should be studying what it is about those people that carry the variant and never get Alzheimer's disease so we can understand what it is that they're doing in their environment that is protective. And it might be that they have higher exposures to toxicants like air pollution, such as particulate matter, NO2, which is a gas, or traffic particles. It might be that they've been exposed to chemicals such as pesticides or solvents or metals. Obesity is clearly a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and diabetes as well as hypertension. And then it may be dietary. I think there's a lot of evidence that certain types of diets, particularly plant-based diets, are healthier, or Mediterranean diets, which include a lot of fish as well as plants. And then lifestyle, exercise, not smoking, and not drinking alcohol. These are choices that we can all make. So in terms of air pollution, we don't always have a choice. The quality of the outdoor air is going to be different, particularly if you live in a city versus a suburb versus a rural area. But there are things you can do. I would recommend getting HEPA filtration devices. These are filters that will take out particulate matter. And if you have a carbon cartridge, it's a little more expensive, but that'll actually grab the gases. NO2 is a gas, it's not a particle. As well. So at a bare minimum, it'll filter out the particulate matter. Plastics are ubiquitous, so are forever chemicals, and pesticides are also quite hard to avoid. But there are ways to reduce your exposure. You may not get it down to zero, but you can definitely reduce it. That could be through organic food or just washing your fruits and vegetables before you eat them or slice them up. And then use ceramic or stainless steel cookware and refillable water bottles rather than using plastic water bottles. I have a reverse osmosis filtration system that I only drink out of, and that actually will take out PFAS. We'll also take out lead if it's in the pipes as well. If you have an older house, that might be a concern. In terms of metabolic risk factors, diabetes is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So do your annual follow-ups. Make sure your glucose is tested and that's within the normal range. But even more importantly, there's a test called hemoglobin A1C, which actually is probably a better test for actually determining if you're pre-diabetic. And if you are, factor that into your lifestyle, both in terms of your diet and exercise. Get a cholesterol profile and see if that's elevated, because heart disease and cholesterol are risk factors for dementia as well. Some other suggestions. When you think about your diet, remember, diet is about substitution. You can say, I'm going to give up something, but you're going to replace it with something else because we all have to eat food. So we have to think of it in terms of substitution rather than giving something up. So I would recommend actually a low carbohydrate diet, which is what I follow. I try to eat plant-based foods, like fruits and vegetables, as much as I can, and lean meat. Mine diets, Mediterranean diets, are pretty established as being healthy. But I think probably the most important thing is to avoid ultra-processed foods. This includes snack foods. Pretty much anything in a bag is probably a snack food, whether if it's a chip or in some kind of chip form. I would avoid diet drinks as well as sugary drinks. I tend only to drink unsweetened tea, coffee, and water. Although in moderation, I think anything is fine. I know tea bags have been linked to microplastics. Those are sort of the plastic, sort of pyramid-shaped tea bags. So I would recommend using either paper bags or just getting loose leaf tea and then making it yourself with that. A little more advice, obviously exercise is always important. And it doesn't have to be really aggressive exercise. Walking every day is important. I would recommend walking roughly 30 minutes. I don't think you need to get 10,000 steps in, but you do need to walk every single day. I actually run every day. Biking is probably where I'm going to head because my knees are starting to ache as I get older. But the important thing is to just keep moving and not to sit too long at a time. I've started lifting weights. Muscle has a higher metabolism than fat. So you'll actually have a higher metabolic rate if you can build up muscle. Also, as you get older, one of the major causes of mortality or morbidity are falls, and you want to be able to get up after you fall. So I think maintaining muscle mass is important as you get older. And I use a smartwatch. It also gives me reminders to get up and move. It's really important to be social. So, I think there was a controversy at one time that alcohol may be beneficial or may have what people called a J-shaped curve. So a little bit was good for you, but it only got toxic at the high levels. I suspect that most of the benefit is the social context in which we drink alcohol. So again, I'm not saying you have to give up, everything completely. If you want to drink, drink in moderation, but also I would recommend not drinking alone, drink in a social context rather than by yourself. I don't think using social media is very social. I think it's very isolating.
Okay, great. Well, we have that was fascinating. Um, Leaves me with a lot of questions. We have already a handful of questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to read them. The first one, for Alzheimer's, are you looking at any specific toxins like organophosphate, pesticides associated with Parkinson's, and do you think there will be eventually public health measures that can be taken to slow the increased incidence of Alzheimer's?
I do think we need to think about how to slow the increasing incidence of Alzheimer's disease. I worry that it starts early in life. So people who are getting Alzheimer's disease now, that trajectory that I talked about probably started in the 1980s or even sooner. And it may be difficult to completely reverse it, but I think we could always slow it down. And I think a healthy lifestyle has been shown to reduce the risk, and it will probably reduce the progression. We need some research on reducing the progression. However, it seems illogical to me that the same sort of things that prevent Alzheimer's disease wouldn't slow down the progression. And quite honestly, it's despite sequencing the human genome and our attempts at the exposome, I think when you really think about what we know about health, it all boils down to eating a healthy diet, exercising, socializing, and avoiding things like alcohol and tobacco and other toxins. So in the end, that seems to be the best way to live your life. And I would definitely advocate for that. I don't think you need, a social media guru to tell you that. I think everybody knows that, perhaps even intuitively. The
Interesting.
hard part is doing it, though. That's the really hard part.
Yeah, for sure. Next question. In analyzing handwritten material for tremors, how are you addressing the lack of evidence of handwritten documents amid the pervasive use of electronic platforms?
I think for now, actually, we can do it because we're talking about people that were born in the 1940s who've developed Parkinson's disease. Going forward, you're absolutely right. That may be more difficult. I think what will happen is people will be asked to write at a doctor's visit. And I think what we need to do is start implementing some of these findings. So even though you may have no tremor right now, we can actually get a baseline by asking you just to write something very simply at this stage of your life, whether in your 30s or 40s, so that it can be saved in your electronic health record so that somebody can look at it going forward. I think that's probably going to be true of writing. So, the technology now is very advanced. So in order to get a sample of your writing, we don't have to even have you type anything. You can just speak into a recording and you can be asked to tell a story. And the idea density and the complexity of the grammar in your speech is probably going to be diagnostic. or it can set the baseline when you're 40 or 50, and we can see the change over time. So I think we have to start collecting this data and so that we can see the change over time, because it is going to be much harder if we don't proactively try to collect it than if we try to go back in time to find it. Although there will be ways to go back in time to find it.
Well, sort of as a follow-up to that, let's say that you were able to see these things that occurred in the past. Aside from really what you've already said about the things that people should be doing, what will that add? What would that information add to that kind of,
Yeah,
prescription?
no, that's a great question. Well, we have to do the research first to see how much it adds, and maybe there may be things that are specific. So there's, about 8 or 9 different components to leading a healthy lifestyle. It may be that certain pieces of that component, like exercise or diet, might be more important for you based on your trajectory. So I think understanding the role of the trajectory is going to be very, very important. And we don't really have a lot of data on that yet. I think a lot of this is in its early stages, and the technology for it has really only come to fore in the last few years. A lot of it's going to be driven by AI. I think it's going to move faster. I think research will likely move faster than it has in the past. Um, my concern is, research is often followed by hype, and so we have to be careful that there isn't too much being overpromised, and I'm trying to be careful in not overpromising that we'll definitely be able to tell from your handwriting at age 19 that whether or not you get Alzheimer's disease. I think there's some intriguing clues that may be possible, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think I would be very suspicious of anybody who said that we are there yet.
Okay. I think that may have answered this next question, sort of, but the question was, how do you account for protective factors when reconstructing the history of risk factors?
Oh, we definitely should want to do that and be cognizant that that's important. I think measuring your BMI over time, whether it's through an electronic health record or whether we could probably reconstruct it from photographs. But I think that's going to be very, very important. I think being able to understand someone's educational attainment is going to be used more and more in health, particularly when it comes to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And again, I think writing is both positive and negative, right? If we have your writing sample and we can see that you have very strong idea density and positive emotions, that's a positive. And so that would be telling us that you maybe have a lower risk for Alzheimer's disease because of that. So a lot of these measurements that I talked about, they will go in either direction.
Interesting. Another question. The merger of health trajectory data with location data seems promising for public health research. However, how might researchers balance this approach with broader safety and privacy concerns from participants, particularly participants from the under-resourced and marginalized communities who would likely be a key target group for this approach?
That's an important question. I think in our society, we have had a two-tiered approach to data security. And I think probably everybody on this call has probably clicked I agree on their phone when they've downloaded an app without reading all of the lawyer text that's in there. If researchers do something like what Apple or Google does, they'd be kicked out of their university and never do research again. So I'm going to make a prediction that Apple and Google are going to get there first, because our society has decided that it's okay when it's a commercial use, but not so great when it's a academic use. But that's just the way the world is, unfortunately. And I do think that I guess where I'm going with this is that it's going to become monetized at some point if corporations do it. And I think we need to think about whether or not the inevitability that I think corporations try to get us to feel about AI and about technology is really an inevitability, or if it's all hype. Because I think we could direct it towards health disparities and trying to understand the environments that people live in so that, we could develop policies or interventions to improve the health of people who are disproportionately suffering from poor environments. My fear is that the way things are evolving, um, it's going to be corporate. And I
Interesting.
think we all need to play a role in trying to redirect that towards the public domain and less towards the corporate domain. But there definitely are advantages that corporations have in the exposome space because, and I'm not trying to dismiss IRB and informed consent. We definitely need to have it. It's just that it's a two-tiered system where for some reason we're willing to acquiesce to corporations need to get data that we would never let academic institutions get
Interesting.
without
Yeah.
informed consent.
Um, I think we have time for one more question, but there are a handful of questions in here, and I hope that there is a way that we can get these answered and get back to people following this. So the next question is, what are some of the prenatal influences on likelihood of developing Alzheimer's later in life?
I think it's still an open question. There hasn't been, there's almost no human research on this. And it's partly because of what I described, where, to do this prospectively and you tried to start this study today, you wouldn't be able to do it because you would die before it's over. And if you think about it, we didn't have the technology to measure blood lead in the 1940s. So even if someone had tried to do it, they wouldn't have been able to. So it's very hard to know. I suspect that if something is neurotoxic to the developing brain, like lead or methyl mercury, it's very likely that it's going to be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And I think as we construct these studies, I think we want to look at the things that we already know first, but we also want to branch out to other environmental factors as well, because we don't know everything about environment and how it affects brain development.
Okay. Well, it sounds like we're going to try to get some answers to the other questions that we've got here and send it out when the recording is sent. Um, so I think maybe we'll ask one more question and then everybody who's currently on here can look forward to getting the answers to these other questions when it gets sent out as a recording. Um, the next one, can you comment on the current research on PFAS and ADRD? What are the major gaps?
I think, and this is true for all environmental research, I think we need to understand the role of timing. I think it's a natural thing that we measure. The first studies are always cross-sectional. So we're looking at people with Alzheimer's disease compared to, say, age-matched controls. So everybody in the study is 70 years old. Well, what set them towards that trajectory that led to Alzheimer's disease probably didn't happen in their 70s, probably didn't happen in their 60s, probably happened long before that, maybe in their 40s or 50s, or even going back to childhood. And I think that is the major gap for virtually everything environmental is we don't know when the exposures happen that are most likely to set you on that trajectory. I think it's unlikely that they happen at age 70 because that's too short a time span. I think they more likely happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. So that's why I think as researchers, it's really important when we think about the exposome to think about how we can reconstruct the past exposome, because that is our most important exposome for understanding why we're healthy or unhealthy today. It's not our exposome today. On the other hand, as I pointed out, our exposome today, particularly if you lead a healthier lifestyle, is capable of changing that trajectory. So we shouldn't dismiss its importance, but we should think about it in context of our past exposome.
Great. Well, I think that we are going to close for today. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. And I think it's been a fascinating conversation. So many great questions in there. And we will get the answers to the ones that we didn't get to talk about. The feedback also is really important. So there's a link in the chat where you can take a short little evaluation, and that would be really helpful. And if today's conversation sparked your interest, we'd love to hear from you and explore ways that you can stay engaged. So thank you all for joining us today.